Hello, walk stars. I am so looking forward to sharing this episode with you. I am currently on the road, so we're just doing this as a solo episode. I am speaking with an extraordinary author, Elissa Altman. I've admired her work from a distance for a long time, and here we actually get to speak in person about the power of walking and the power of writing from a place of uncertainty. I so look forward to hearing what you think. Come on over to Instagram and let us know. Enjoy this episode and have a great walk.
Blind Nil Audio.
I'm Alex L.
I'm Libby Delana. Welcome
to This Morning Walk podcast.
Good morning, Elissa.
Good morning, Libby.
Welcome to This Morning Walk podcast. I said to you earlier before we started recording that I was kind of a little bit nervous. And the reason I was nervous is I so love your writing so much. And you and I have been communicating, I don't know how long, about walking.
I would say 5 years, something like that. And I have to thank you so much for having me on. It's just a thrill. And I love everything that you write and post and talk about. And, and someday I will plunge, but not just yet.
Fair enough. Oh my gosh, to have you say that out loud is, I guess it's the Mutual Admiration Society. So thank you for joining. I'm so sorry Alex couldn't join us. I know she feels equally the same love affair that I do.
No,
but
that's wonderful. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. And I'm trying to remember what it was that prompted me potentially originally to reach out. I think, were you writing about walking? I'm trying to remember the specific thing that made me brave enough to reach out to someone I so admire on a whim.
Thank you. I don't remember. Maybe I had quoted, what is it, Lauren Elkins?
Oh yes.
About walking. I also, what is the Latin quote
Imbetur,
about
yes.
about
Everything solved by walking.
everything is
Yes.
solved by, right, Salvatore Ambulando.
Ambulato, yes.
And I had used that in Motherland. I had used that quote in Motherland, and
Yes.
then the people who run Peg and All, Margot Kent, one
Yes.
amazing company, amazing. She actually started creating jewelry that said Salvatore Ambulando, and so maybe that I think I had written about it. So,
those of us who love walking, we find each other. We just can't help it. So here we are.
Here we are.
Here we are. So you know what? I'll do my best to sort of tell our walk stars who you are, but I probably will gush. Who knows? I may get choked up. Who's to know? We'll find out. But I am so excited to have Elissa Altman here today with us. She's the author of Motherland, a memoir of love, loathing, and longing. And to be perfectly honest, that title, when I first read it, that title, we'll get to this, but that resonated so much. You are also the author of a critically acclaimed TRAIF, My Life as an Unorthodox Outlaw. Again, a title that somehow when I saw that, before I'd read a word, I felt like, oh, this is a place where I need to spend some time. And quite honestly, and you are the author of Poor Man's Feast, a love story of comfort, desire, and the art of simple cooking, which is, if I'm correct, a James Beard award-winning blog. Also,
right. The blog that was connected to it. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. And I think, I don't know how long ago this came out. You were on a podcast with Debbie Millman, who said something along the lines of, no one writes about food, familial relationships in the incredibly insightful way that you do. I don't know that I've quoted her entirely correctly, but I would second that you're writing about food. Sits right next to MFK Fisher,
Oh God, thank you.
who I adore and
Well,
was
I'm done
yes.
here. No.
The
No, thank you.
the love fest continues. Well,
Yeah.
as someone who actually myself, I went to cooking school and met MFK Fisher and never got over how beautifully she wrote about food. It's when I started reading your blog that I thought, oh wow, here's someone else who feels the same
Wow.
way
Thank
and
you so
writes
much.
as beautifully. So we have a lot to discuss. My first question to you, well, first off, golly, we're both walkers. We both
Yes.
love, I'll call it the art of walking.
Yes.
So my first question to you, what are you walking with right now? I mean, I know, you know, Motherland came out a little while ago. I think from your Instagram, you're in the midst of a new manuscript. So what are you walking with now? It can be both physical, it can be spiritual,
Oh, great. What a
whatever it is.
great question. Yeah, so Motherland came out originally in 2019, right on the
Yes.
heels of COVID, and then the paperback
Yes.
came out in 2021, just as COVID was ending, which is, I have to
Mm.
say, the marketing people at my publishers were just like, what did we
Yes.
do? We have no idea. Um,
Yes.
but I've been working on a book called On Permission, and it is about creativity and
Mm.
permission, and the permission that we give ourselves
Mm.
to make art, in whatever form that art comes, whether we are bakers or cooks or painters or photographers, or certainly in my case, a writers, artists, playwrights, poets. I maintain that we are the art making species. I mean, that's something that Robert
Mm.
McFarlane has said, and I'm an enormous fan of his, the author of Underland and a bunch of other
Yes.
extraordinary
Yeah.
things. And that, I mean, that Underland is sort of like my Bible. I mean, it's sitting right off to the side as I'm talking
Right.
to you. But permission came about, and of course, it's on permission on the broad in the broader sense of the word as well. So, what are the stories that we have permission to tell? What are the stories that we don't have permission to tell? What are we allowed to write
Mm.
about? What are we not allowed to write about? Where does that come from? What do our cultures say we can talk about versus? So it's,
Mm.
it's at the macro level and the micro level. And the micro level is really sort of what I'm interested in, because it's something that every one of us faces, mostly women, mostly
Oh,
women.
interesting. Yeah.
Um, and it came from, the book came out of an essay that I'd written for Krista Tippett's On Being blog back in 2016, and was connected to a situation that I very sadly found myself in after my first book came out in 2013. And Poor Man's Feast had come out. It was a linear book, love story. I met this person. I had to make a decision. Do I leave New York City? Do I not? What are the things the things that happened after I left? So I thought it was, with a little bit of backstory. And so I thought it was a pretty basic book, filled with love, filled with food, new relationships, old relationships. And about three-quarters of the way through the book, in about 8 lines towards the end, I told a story about my paternal grandmother, who in 1926 left her family for between 3 and 4 years. We don't have the exact dates. My father was three. My aunt was five, or no, was actually eight. And eventually, I mean, my grandmother came back, and then she became sort of a pariah in the family. Mothers
Mm.
don't leave their children.
Yeah.
In my culture,
Right.
we're always spoon-fed. Jewish mothers don't leave their children, which I think it's much broader than that. It's
Yes. Yes.
um and what I didn't know when I wrote the book, all parties are, at this point are long dead, except for my
Yes.
aunt, who
Yep.
was in her late 90s. what I didn't know was that while the story was a story that I had been spoon-fed as a child, my father spent most of my young life trying to metabolize that grief,
Oh,
by
yeah.
bringing it inappropriately or not to the dining room table. We talked about it over breakfast. We talked about it all the time. What I didn't know was that my aunt hid it from her family. So
Fascinating.
that was the way she metabolized it.
Yes.
And so the book comes out. There are 8 lines that blow the lid off this great family secret that I had no idea was a secret, and it turned my life upside down. I lost most of that family. Um, it was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. They were like sisters to me. I was very close to them, and I think that they were, and to a large extent still are, so invested um, in creating this sort of veneer of beauty and love and perfection and all of those things, that was really more important to them, to
Yeah.
maintaining that. And so, and my father was long gone at this point, but the question that came out of that was,
Right.
do you know that a story is a secret if no one tells you it's a secret? Um,
Right.
how do you know you're allowed to write what you want, what you have to write about, what you have to write about? And it took me about, I would say like 2 years to get to the point where I couldn't have had this conversation with you, right after it happened, because it was so
Mm.
traumatic.
Mm.
And so when you talk about walking and what is it that I'm walking with now, I just turned the manuscript into my publisher. It's going into copy editing now, which means that I'm at the, oh my God, what did I do point?
Right.
Like,
Right.
oh
What have I
no,
said? What have I written?
what have I
Yes.
said? What have I written? And I teach a lot of workshops about this subject, to workshoppers and students who range from National Book Award winning novelists who
Oh my
are
gosh.
stepping into memoir for the first time, to new memoirists. And this is
Yes.
a question that touches
Everybody.
everyone. And
Right.
so I would say for the first 2 or 3 years after it happened, every walk that I did, every hike that I
Yes.
did,
Yes.
was an attempt with every step to pull myself through
Mm.
this profound, grief at losing these people who I loved. And, and I'm not, shy about saying it, still love very much.
Yeah. Of course.
Um, so that is what I'm walking with right now, and have been now for a while. And that's why that quote, Salvatore Amulando, is so profound, in my
Yeah.
life.
Oh, that's it's a really touching story, and I think obviously I don't know that sense of, I'll call it grief
Yeah,
or uncertainty at that moment, but um, I'm glad you had your walking practice as a companion during that time.
yeah.
And I think the concept, there's two things that have, well, several things that came to mind as you were talking about it. Number one is walking art. You talked about, people finding their craft and so
Mhm.
that's one question. The other thing that really struck me is this notion of permission, and how is it that we are able to recognize or understand what truth are we allowed to speak out loud? How do we navigate? How do we understand? How do we, I think it's hard for people to think they have permission to share very honestly about complicated relationships that they might have, especially with parents,
Mhm.
especially with family.
Yeah.
Um, does it require permission to actually speak it out loud? Are there variety of truths? So I think that's such a powerful inquiry about the act of creation and storytelling, and what we are able to actually put, what words we are willing to put on paper, which actually brings me to your beautiful book, Motherland. I just, it is so powerful and so, um, I think the thing about it is that I couldn't help but be just in awe of your ability to speak the truth about what feels like certainly a very dynamic and complicated relationship. And back to permission to be able to speak that out loud, Lissa, just is such exquisite bravery. And what I took away from it was just incredible bravery around being willing to speak that and write that. Can you tell us about what that process was like, or tell us about Motherland to begin with? It is one of the books when I read it, I could hardly put it down.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. Yeah, you know, it's a funny thing. I mean, there's a really famous James Baldwin quote, which I know I'm going to mangle, about the fact that we all have one story to tell,
Yes.
and that story, no matter what we write, no matter what we create,
Yes.
keeps getting retold over and over and over again until it becomes larger, it gets smaller, the focus on it changes, the focal plane on it changes. Um, and I knew, very early on that I was going to write about my mother. My mother and I have had an extraordinarily complicated relationship. I would say from the word go. She didn't know she was pregnant with me for 6 months, which is, how does that happen?
Right.
Lots of ways. She
Yes.
was body dysmorphic. There was anorexia involved, and so one of the questions that I fielded a lot when I was on tour was, well, how did she not
How'd
know?
you
Didn't
know?
she get her period? And I remember speaking to a group, and someone raised their hand and said, well, no, she probably had stopped getting it,
Exactly.
and
She was so, yes.
because she
Yeah.
was so slim, and I mean, slim is not. She was
Mm.
not slim. She was really not well, but um, so she didn't know she was pregnant with me for 6 months until she couldn't get her rings off, and her fingers were swollen. And a
Mm.
cousin of mine said to her, "Well, maybe you're pregnant," and sent her off to the doctor. 16-year-old cousin had to tell her.
Yes. Yes.
So, and then that became an issue of, how is her body going to change while she's carrying a baby? And when I was born, I was 4 pounds. Um,
Oh,
and which, if you think about 4 pounds, and supermarket chickens are bigger than
right.
4 pounds,
A bag of flour.
bag of
Right.
flour, heavier than
Yes.
4 pounds, right?
Right.
So, so I always wrote about her in some way,
Yeah.
whether in my journals and notebooks. Um, I had a year-long column in the Washington Post
Mm.
called "Feeding My Mother," which was ostensibly about feeding senior citizens who don't like food, who will not be fed. But over the course of the year, I realized it was more about
Mm.
sustaining my mother,
Mm.
and
Mm.
how could I sustain someone who would not be sustained? And sustenance comes in,
Yes.
every form.
Yes.
So that was really where it had come from. And I had been speaking with an editor at Random House for a long time about it, and they offered me a book deal, and I, was thrilled and honored to be there. And I was 6 months into writing what had been a very, very different book. And then my mother had a catastrophic fall. And
Mm.
so and I had to sort of toss that, that
That
like six
first
months of
part.
work.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
what I realized was, what I had written about at the beginning, which was theoretical and in hindsight and conjecturing, and was suddenly put into real time. And I was
Mm.
called to take care of her.
Mhm.
I was called to be her caregiver. I had to take over her finances, which were a complete wreck. Um, and so I had been sort of emotionally estranged from this person, for
Mm.
years.
Mhm.
And suddenly I found myself living with her day to day and dealing with medical issues and senior issues which afflict every older person in this country. I don't care whether they're wealthy or they're not wealthy. Everybody faces this.
Yes.
And so I had to go back and rewrite this book. And that was one of the most complicated things that I've ever had to do writing wise. Never a good idea to write a story of any kind while the story is unfolding, because
Right.
it's like you're sort of like it's like a lotus that starts to open and you have
N
no idea where it's going to take you. None.
Right. Right. How did you do that? I mean, how does one even do that? That's
Yeah.
what a craft.
It was really hard. And Um, I think that the thing that was most helpful for me, and it's something that I teach a lot, is whenever we're writing memoir, we have to create ourselves as narrator, um, representative of us, but in fact a character,
S Yeah,
and we have to
separately. Yeah.
snip
Mm.
that connection, between ourselves and the page, so that we're able to sort of step back and look down into the diorama of our lives, um, and see our lives as it's unfolding, and as
Yes.
it's unfolding with this other person. And when we do that, we're able to write with, hopefully clarity and distance, but also fairness. Um,
Mm. Mhm.
because
Mm.
no one is a perfect person. Narrators aren't perfect people. There's that great Vivian Gornick quote, and I'm looking at my bulletin board to see if it's up there. So, the great Vivian Gornick quote, which is, "For the drama to deepen, we need to see the cunning of the innocent and the loneliness of the monster."
Oh,
And
will you say that again?
for
Oh,
the
wow.
for the drama to deepen, we need to see the cunning of the innocent and the loneliness of the monster. And that
Oh,
paragraph,
wow.
those lines, were the lines that allowed me
Mm.
to
Mm.
step into this story
Mhm.
and write not from a place of revenge or not from a place of
Mm-mm.
rage. Well, there was plenty of rage in the book, but not from a place of rage. Um, but to try and write it from a place of humanity,
Mm.
and showing the lives of these two women, who are aging in tandem, you
Yeah,
know. So
right. Well, I think one of the things that's most powerful is the way you write about mother-daughter dynamic is there's sort of this really exquisite, what feels like exquisite honesty that potentially allows more women to see their own complicated relationships with their mother in a way that is tender and caring and lovely. As you just said, you are able to put yourself in that role with fairness and humanity, and yet it remains complicated. It remains what it is. And you've used the word addiction when it comes to your mother,
mhm.
and the word loathing in the title. Those are powerful, powerful words, especially in the context of family and our mothers as daughters. Say
Yeah,
more about
yeah.
that. How was it cathartic to write this? What were you separated enough from the story that it wasn't about a healing moment? It was again about this telling of the story with recognition, honesty, respect, fairness.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's what I tried to do, and I hope I accomplished it. I don't know, but is write with some degree of fairness. And
Mm,
my plan, it wasn't really a plan, but it was my hope that I was going to come out the other side of it with a different sense of who my mother is and who
yes.
my mother was, and how she got to this place and how we got to this place.
Yes.
Um, you know, early on, I remember when there was press about the fact that I was doing this book, I was writing this book. I had had a column in the Washington Post that was fairly popular. I've been talking about my mother for a long time, writing
Yes.
about her for a long time. And one of the questions that was posed to me was, well, is this going to be like Mommy Dearest? And, those of us of a certain
Yes.
age will
Yes.
remember Mommy Dearest, which was
Of course.
written by Christina Crawford about her mother, the actress Joan Crawford. And of course, there was a horrific movie made about it
Right. Right.
with Faye. I think Faye
Faye
Dunaway
Dunaway. Yes.
played the
Yes.
lead role, and it
Yes.
was, I mean, it was just, it was terrorizing and terrifying. And I
Yes.
was so surprised when this person asked me that question, because I thought that, that there's no way that that's, I wasn't trying to seek revenge or to try,
No.
what I wanted to do was I wanted to gain some level of clarity on who this person is and who they were and how they got to the place where they are now, and the arc of their life,
Mm-hmm.
in terms
Mm-hmm.
of disappointment, and how do we metabolize
Mm.
constant disappointment. I think that some people are more, they're better equipped to deal with the vagaries of everyday life, which includes, of course, regret and disappointment. And some people are not, and she has
Right.
not been able to do that. And then also to try and understand my own responses to her,
Mm-hmm.
and to
Mm-hmm.
growing up in a home with someone who suffers from fairly severe mental illness. My mother's been clinically diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, which is not, it's not treatable.
Right.
It's certainly not curable, but it's not treatable. And it makes for, I think, a very lonely existence
Yeah.
for that person. Um, but that was really what my goal was to try and understand who these two women were and are, and to give myself the permission to ask those questions,
Yeah.
um, in a way that was not salacious
Yes.
and not vengeful, but to just really try and understand, and hopefully in a way that would sort of peel back layers for other adult
Yes.
daughters, estranged adult daughters. Um, my mother and I still have a very, very complicated relationship. Before we hit the record button, I had told you that I literally had to take my phone off the hook, because I told my mother that I was going to be in this conversation with you, and hung the phone up, and instantly she called back.
Yeah.
Because that's what NPDs do,
Right.
but to have the permission to recognize my life as the daughter of someone living with
Yeah.
a profound mental illness, and also to look at her and think she's living alone. She's been living alone now since
Yes.
1997, and she's an enormously strong woman. She just is. And very few people have ever told her that. She
Mm.
doesn't feel
Mm.
that about herself. Um, and I never really thought about her that way
Mm-hmm.
until I'd written the book.
Read the book. Well, I would say that as I read it, I felt exquisite compassion and honesty at the same time, which is a really beautiful balance. I don't feel I certainly, having not lived the life, I don't know, but it felt as if you were willing to, tell the full story, and that was
Mhm.
part of the inquiry to your own life and your life together.
Right.
And I guess I just wonder, I heard you say, I think in an interview, or perhaps um, in, either a podcast or an interview, that to wait for permission to tell one story, and I think you noted, especially if one is a woman, is to wait forever. And the idea that why is it that why is it that we don't give ourselves permission to tell these stories? Or what, to say more about that notion that um, to give ourselves permission to tell these stories means that we might wait forever, and especially women. I wonder
Yeah.
what that is.
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are the caregivers. We are the
Yes. Yeah.
nurturers, where we are culturally, that is who we are. And going back to the garden, if you believe in the garden,
Yeah.
you know that's the way, that has been historically the place of women in
Yes. Yeah.
in our culture and society. You take that to another step, women of color
Yes.
have absolutely, I mean, the question of permission for women of color has until recently really rarely been posited, because it was just understood that, well, you don't really have permission to say anything, so
Right.
we don't really want to, we're not even going to think about that. And that is, of course, a profound tragedy. That's a profound
Tragedy. Yes.
tragedy. And then you hear stories of women like Sojourner Truth, and of course, these are the stories that have to be told,
Yes.
and no one was going to give um, women of color back then any permission,
Any
and that really
space.
hasn't changed very much. But
Right.
I think that we now, we tend to second guess ourselves. We don't want to make waves. We don't want to
Right.
ruffle feathers. We don't want to be the problem makers. Um, we are often the carriers of the truth, but we want everything okay. Everybody needs to be okay, and we put ourselves last, and we put our own stories and our own myths
Mm,
last.
mm, mm.
And the number of people certainly, and the number of women I've known who've gone through their lives without being able to write or make art that expresses their stories is it's enormous. And as a result of that, all of my workshops, most of my workshops and most of my classes tend to skew a little bit older.
Mm.
And I mean, I had a very well-known National Book Award winning author in one of my workshops, and when she showed up, I was like, "Oh my God, what are you do what are
Right.
you doing here?" And she was wonderful and lovely and brilliant as always, as ever. And I said to her, and I said to the whole group one day, what is it that is keeping you from
Mhm.
writing or your story? And she said, well, I don't want to upset my family. I don't want to turn over the apple cart. And then it came out that the family that she was worried about upsetting was like dead for 150
Oh,
years.
isn't that
So
something still?
then it becomes like, a
Right.
historical thing. I don't want to
Right.
be the person to overturn the apple cart, much less set
Right.
it ablaze.
Yes. Yes. No, I isn't that amazing? 100
Yeah,
years and it still felt that way. That's how
right.
deeply embedded it is. Was there any point in writing this book or even your new book where there was sort of exquisite resistance that you had to break through? And I guess the second part of that question is, if the answer is yes, was it possible that walking was at all part of that creative process to, I love your word, metabolize? Is it to get to a place where there might have felt a barrier? How did you
Yeah,
work through that? Where were the sort of little pockets that enabled you to work through the places that felt scratchy and prickly and hard?
yeah,
Where was
yeah.
that?
Well, I have to preface the answer to that by saying that the whole idea of writing a book
Yeah.
connected to my workshops, but the whole idea of writing a book that came out of the trauma that I had experienced by being excised by my family of origin, who I adored and, loved. Um, I was like, wait a minute, what am I doing? Am I doing this all over again? Am I doing this all over again?
Right.
Um,
Right.
Giving myself permission to write about permission
Mm.
was a really difficult thing to do. And it was,
Mm.
I maintain it's the most complicated and probably the hardest book I've ever had to write and story that I've had to tell, because I had to write it in context. I couldn't just write a
Yeah.
how-to book.
Right.
Um, but there was a lot of like, oh my gosh, this is like, it was like walking, but walking on broken glass.
No.
Very, very precarious and very painful. And
Mm.
wherever I stepped, there was going to be more blood, it was going to be terrible.
Mhm.
And I did everything that I could, to sort of pull my way through the story and this sort of unpacking of what creative permission means, um, through the lens of my own experience, certainly, but also through the lens of a lot of other the experiences of other women writers, people like Honor Moore and Mary Karr,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
Doris Lessing, and people, and Danny Shapiro, people like that. And with the knowledge that at the end of the day, when I had a book come out, it was going to be ripping the Band-Aid off, again. So that was very hard. I have an extraordinary publisher, not the same publisher I've had in the past, but a much smaller publisher that really specializes in fairly literary works and poetry, and they were amazing. And I have just a great editor, very sensitive, very sensitive to the time that it was going to take me to tell this story.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in terms of walking, we spend a lot of time in Maine. Susan and I spend a lot of time in Maine, and um, we do a lot of walking there. This last year was a little bit more complicated. There were knee problems and back problems and hip
Mm.
problems.
Mhm.
Welcome to my sixth decade,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and but walking, whether it was in Maine, by the water, by the ocean, and I'm a Cancerian, so I am very drawn to water and to the moon.
Mm.
And if it's a full moon and I'm by the ocean, forget it. All all
All
bets are
bets are off.
all bets are off. Um, but I found myself walking in a way that can only be described as meditative. Um, and my wife, and we've been together for 25, it'll be 25 years next January, and she did walking meditation with Thich Nhat Hanh in Washington D.C. in the, I want to say, the 90s,
My gosh.
around the reflecting pool,
Mm.
and to the Vietnam War Memorial. So she's certainly very familiar,
Mm.
with that, but it was not intentional on my part. Um, I, according to my doctors, I was supposed to be walking very quickly, but that didn't
Right.
really happen because I think, apart from the fact that I'm really small and my strides are like about that big, um, I just, I just needed to move my body
Yeah.
forward. And
Mm.
if I was going to be
It's
writing
beautiful.
about these difficult stories and scenarios, I needed to keep moving my body forward. And my grandmother was a great walker, and I actually haven't written about that, but my mother's mother was a tremendous walker, and walked probably 3 miles every day into her
Mm.
80s.
Mm.
My mother, before her accident, walked from the Upper West Side, where she lives, to the East Side, where I lived, and then back
Mm.
again,
Mm.
probably 5 miles a day. So this was very much a thing for us. And I always knew while I was writing that I was getting into a place of trouble if I didn't want to walk.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Susan would say, let's go for a walk. Let's take the dog for a walk. The dog has to walk. Let's walk.
Yes,
And
yeah.
I'd be like, I just can't do it. I just can't do it. And that became really reflective of my own mindset and my own heart while I was, digging back into the story of excision and the things we're allowed to tell and the things we're not allowed to tell.
Wow, that's a very powerful story, and I'd like to hear about your grandmother's walking sometime. Will you please write a piece on that?
Yes, I will. Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Absolutely.
here's the thing. I've spoken with many people about walking, and people have certainly said it's meditative, it's spiritual, it's healing, it's
Mhm.
obviously physical and creative. A time for introspection, maybe even a place for innovation. And I think in my conversation with you right now, is walking art? Is there a place where we can hold that simple activity as as a creative expression? I have often found it a place to be creative,
Mhm.
but I don't think I, until this conversation, ever thought of it as its own creative expression. As an act, it is artful. And I don't know what I mean by that. And
Yeah,
maybe this is for another conversation for you and me, but what are your thoughts on that?
that's really extraordinary. I mean, I have not really ever considered that, but I think that, when you think about what was the moment that, the humans stood up on,
Right.
and took a step forward and took another step forward. And certainly, when we look at babies and, we have a new baby in my family who's my
Mm.
little cousin is um, too. And I remember that moment of like watching her going, am I gonna
Right. It's
grabbing on? And she
wobbly.
was just like,
Yes.
I just want to walk. Everybody get out of my
Yes.
way. I just, and I
Yeah.
think that there is absolutely art to that as well. I would be very curious, and I'm sure studies have been done about this, and maybe we can go back into our own corners after our conversation is over, and you'll research it, and I'll research it, and we can come back together at some point. But I would be very curious about neurologically, do the same brain centers light up when one is making art, writing, painting,
Mm. Hmm.
whatever it
Right.
is, singing,
Right. Right.
do the same brain centers light up as they would when you're walking? Has that ever been
Studied.
studied? I think we need to talk to Dr. Amen about that.
I
And I'm
think you're
sure
right.
that
Yes.
he would know, but um I'd be really curious about that. And when I think about art and walking, I'm a huge fan of Myra Kalman's,
Oh,
and I yeah, and
amazing.
she still lives in the city in the village, and I remember reading about her saying that when she gets stuck creatively, and Myra Kalman actually gets stuck creatively, which is like,
Hard to believe.
I
Right.
there's no hope for the rest of us.
Right.
You know, that she will go out for a walk,
Yes.
and the act of walking
Yes.
um, sort of combs out the knots, out, that she's running into. And whether it's being in the city and being surrounded by other people and sensory issues and
Stimulus.
textures and
Yeah.
colors and the olfactory and the oral, AURA, is maybe that has to do with it. I don't know,
Mhm.
but I
Mhm.
would be very surprised if it didn't.
I would agree. I've always sort of felt that as I go out for a walk, if I have something that I'm trying to solve, I visualize this sort of beautiful, literally a knot, a ball of
Mhm.
thread or string or yarn, all sort of. And as I walk, it just gently loosens. It
Mhm.
just, each thread
I
becomes
love
its
that.
own own entity such that I can begin to identify each thread. When it's all together, it's one entity. You can't possibly see the structure,
Yeah,
the details. But as we walk, we begin to hold space, put a little space around each, and be able to identify what it
that's
is.
great.
But
I love that. I
it
love that image. Yeah,
it's a yeah, it's sort of it's certainly a creative process, but it's also I always say that by adding motion to my emotions, I can understand them. Otherwise, I have no idea
that's
how to
great.
understand them.
That's
But how
wonderful.
about if we do this? How about if you and I will go back to our studio, so we'll do some research, and a
Yeah,
year from now we'll have this conversation again, and we will have
I
the
would love
answer.
to. I would love to. That'd be
It's
great. That'd be great.
such an interesting question. I mean, we certainly hear stories of I've heard stories of Virginia Woolf and certainly Steve Jobs, who used as one of their most powerful tools was going for a walk to solve
Hmm.
all sorts of things. But it's a really, really interesting question. Thank you for raising it. And
Absolutely.
thank you for joining me. I have to say, this is a dream come true. I'm not sure what I'm going to do for the rest of the week except go for a walk and be grateful that you joined me.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm really honored that you asked me. So
Oh,
thank
it's
you.
will you tell everybody where we can find you and
Yes,
how we can keep an eye out for this next beautiful book?
thank you. Yeah. So I have a very fairly active Substack
Yes.
presence, and that's poormansfeast.substack.com. And my website is elissaaltman.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook a little bit less than I used to be. Thank everybody or whoever's up there,
Right.
because Facebook can get very swampy. Can get very
Yes.
swampy. Um,
Great description.
and yeah, and the book right now is scheduled for early 2025. So, as we get closer, I mean, it can be pre-ordered, which, as any author will say, is we're not just hawking our books when we say that. There's actually reason for pre-orders, and,
That's right.
print quantities have to do with it, and, but it's out there. And I just really look forward to continuing this conversation and to walking with you. You have to walk really slowly, though, because I know you're very tall.
It's true. You know what? We'll meet each other where it feels great
Okay.
to both of us. But
Okay.
thank you so much, and we will certainly share out with our walk stars when your book comes out. And really, thank you so much. I think it was, however many years ago, I just reached out, and because I admired you so I'm really grateful you're here. And
Well,
thank you
thank you
for this
so much.
conversation. And everybody, I really recommend that you get Motherland. It's an absolutely beautiful story. As I said, it's told with compassion and honesty, and they are the stories we need to tell and hear. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're the best.
Thank you, Libby. It's
Okay.
great to talk to you.
This Morning Walk is a production of Blind Nil Audio, hosted by me, Alex L.
And me, Libby Delana, produced and edited by Chris Jacobs.
If you find value and meaning in the conversations that Libby and I have, please share the show with a friend and consider leaving a 5-star review. Comments on Apple Podcasts really help us out. When you do that, it introduces this show to a bigger audience. Thank you so much for listening.
You are wonderful. Have a great walk.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Chip and Joanna Gaines, Blind Nil Audio, nor Magnolia.